the Mormons had always said Pearsall's documents out here in Utah that she gave to these newspapers in the 1870s time frame are an invention. They aren't true. Voila! They opened this one package, and it's the 1826 period of court documents. And here is the judge's bill to the county for trying Joseph Smith, the glass looker. Their charges to the county for their hearing with Joseph Smith, the glass looker, match the papers that this Miss Pearsall saved, and the date and the charges, everything matched.
Wow.
So we know that it's all authentic. Well, just because some people were into it doesn't mean that it was ordained of God or was respectable or was on honest business.
Welcome to the Distinctive Christianity podcast, where we do deep dives in Mormon and Christian history, theology, and biography. Big one today, we're going to be discussing the man Joseph Smith, and we're going to talk about some of those founding claims. I have the great honor of not only recording from the Gerald and Sandra Tanner Research Library at the Utah Christian Research Center, but to be joined by Sandra Tanner herself. Thank you so much, Sandra. What do we know about Joseph Smith's early life? You know, there's a standard story most people hear from the missionaries about him being Bible-believing and maybe even church-going, but, you know, what other evidence do we have about his involvement in things like magic and such?
Well, we know that as early as 1823, Joseph Smith was involved in money digging, magic, using a seer stone, and evidently already had the idea of doing some sort of book, a record of some way connected to the American Indians. So you could say that's kind of the start of Mormonism. Yeah. But what he was known for in the community was that in the early 1820s, he had found a special rock in a well that he determined was a seer stone. And a seer stone was like crystal ball gazing, that you could look at this rock and get messages from it. Now, this wasn't an idea that Joseph came up with. This was an established magical practice with a long history of people claiming to use magic stones or objects of some way to determine your future or what's going on in your life or directive for your life, find buried treasure, discover minerals in the ground. We know the Smiths were involved with this money digging idea. They also were involved with the idea of water witching, which was very popular in the New England area, and I think is still popular in the Vermont area, where you had a Y-shaped stick, and you would hold it at the Y part with the pointer out in front of you, and you could walk over your land and determine if water was there or minerals. Some people used it in magic practices to find buried treasure. And so the Smiths, Joseph and his father, were already involved in the magic scene in Vermont before they even moved to New York. So the early years of Joseph Smith were spent as a teenager in this magic worldview. And there's a book called that, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview by Michael Quinn, where a Mormon scholar, he goes and researches this whole thing of how the Smiths were involved in magical practices before the advent of Mormonism. So this stone that he finds in this well, he claims has magic properties. And he would put it in his hat, and you could pay him to walk over your property, and he would tell you if there was a buried treasure. Now, the reason there were these ideas was back in that day, not everyone had access to a bank. And so many people would hide their money or treasures somewhere on their farm. And consequently, if Farmer Brown hid the family treasure and then died, and he hadn't told anyone where it was at, you might hire some guy to walk over the property and see if he could discern where it was buried. There were rumors that Captain Kidd of pirate fame had come into that area, and other pirates, and somewhere along the area had buried some of their treasures. So there were reasons that people were out looking for treasure. It wasn't just out of the blue. This evidently intrigued Joseph Smith, and so he's out having people pay him to walk over their property to tell them if there's buried treasure. But this becomes the beginning of Mormonism, because people that supported him and agreed with this practice were his first converts into his new faith. So people say, well, how could Joseph Smith get people to believe in him? Well, they already were believing in his claim that this rock gave him special messages. Now, we get up to a few years later in 1826, and a farmer from down in the Pennsylvania area hears of Joseph's fame from a brother that lived in the Palmyra, New York area. And he comes up, Mr. Stoll, he comes up to the Palmyra area and hires Joseph Smith to come down to his area and look for a lost silver mine that he had heard about some way. Now, the Mormons will admit in their writings of the history that he did go work for this Mr. Stoll, but they don't want to make it that he was hired because of his ability to see in the stone. They want to paint the picture he was hired to come help dig. But no, he's there specifically because of the stone. And most Mormon historians wouldn't contest that area. So you have him doing this work for Mr. Stoll. Mr. Stoll's nephews become worried that Joseph Smith's ripping him off and that he's giving them a con game on finding a treasure. They never do find a treasure, but the nephews are evidently involved in getting a lawsuit against Joseph for fraud. And so Joseph Smith is tried on a misdemeanor as Joseph Smith the Glass Looker. Now, the Glass Looker charge would be equivalent to saying he was like traveling gypsies using crystal balls to tell your fortune. And so it comes under the vagrancy law of no visible means of support. You're just coming to the community, getting people to pay you money for something that you can't produce or come through with of whatever your promise was. So it was seen as fraud when you were claiming these magic powers. So at this hearing, Joseph Smith says he's not guilty. His plea is, I really have a stone. It really works. I really can get messages from it, but I don't use it now because it hurts my eyes. And so I'm done with that part, because he has to show that it's not a fraud. Right. He has to claim, I really have the gift in order to evade the charge of fraud. I really have a stone. It really works, but I'm not using it now because it hurts my eyes. Okay, so Mr. Stoll is called as a witness. And Mr. Stoll says, oh, I know he really has the gift, because he told us if we dug down, we got to a certain point, we would find a feather. And if we dug further past the feather, we would hit this place where the treasure was. And when we were digging, we found the feather. And we kept digging, and we hit a hard place. And for one reason or another, the treasure was sinking away or something, and we weren't able to retrieve the treasure. But we found the feather, so therefore, I know he has this gift. Well, from an outside point of view, I look at that and I think, oh, well, how hard is it for you to just pull a feather out of your pocket and stick it in the dirt? Oh, look at that, here's the feather. But I think some people have observed that if you really had a feather in an old dig from a couple hundred years ago, would it still be in pristine condition when you pulled it out of the dirt? Anyways, Mr. Stoll was converted that he really had this gift. Well, the problem for Joseph Smith and for Mormonism today on the Book of Mormon is that it's that same stone that he's going to use to translate his gold plates that he later claims he finds. So he switches the story from I am a glass looker being able to find buried treasures for you to I am a prophet, seer, and revelator who has a stone that God has blessed that I can find buried records of God in the ground, and this stone will allow me to translate it. So it's the same scenario. He's just shifted what the story is. And so the beginnings of Mormonism is steeped in magic. It's steeped in the occult. They were going out at midnight, drawing magic circles, doing incantations. There's a claim of them sacrificing a sheep, and I think somebody even mentions a dog, where you'd go out like at midnight or something and have a magic circle, and the Smiths owned magic parchment and sword, a dagger and stuff that the church, I think, concedes today. They don't like to talk about it. But anyways, the Mormons have the artifacts from Joseph Smith's early money digging and magic. So they have to some way smooth over that to make it sound acceptable to people today. That, oh no, he wasn't like gypsies with a crystal ball. No, this is a prophet of God using a God-ordained stone. But they have to ignore the magic part and just emphasize the stone that he used to translate the plates, all of which looks like the beginning of Mormonism has a very sketchy beginning, that it looks like it starts as a deliberate way of conning people for him to tell them where treasures are buried. And as far as we know, no one ever claimed to find a treasure. The church admits he was doing this treasure digging, but no one can produce a witness that'll say, yeah, we found it.
Yeah.
So it makes the whole beginning look a little sketchy.
Absolutely. So there's this attempt to either, at least they used to do it's in spite of, he gave that up, he repented of it, and then to try to distinguish what was occurring with the Book of Mormon, and Moroni being the spirit of the treasure, or Nephi, from the magical practices happening around the family, or to compartmentalize it. There are other ways of doing it. Do you remember when they published the picture of the seer stone?
Oh, yes, that was an amazing thing. I don't remember what year that was. Is that about 15 years ago? I'm not sure. 10 years.
10, 11 years ago.
Yeah, 10 years ago maybe. Yes, we knew that they had the stone. Grant Palmer, Mormon fellow that's now dead, but he wrote a book,
Insider's View
of Mormon Origins. And he tells in there, because he was in the church educational system, but he tells in his book that he saw some of the seer stones up at the church office building.
Wow.
So, which was before the church ever did the photos. But he tells in his book about, I saw some of those stones up at the church historian's office. So we knew that they were still there. The church had them all this time, but they did finally, the Mormon church did finally actually put out photos of the chocolate-colored one. And I think they have a couple others in the vault that we haven't got pictures of, or at least if the pictures are out there, they haven't been labeled as Joseph Smith's, because there were a few other early Mormons that had stones as well. John Whitmer and Hiram Page. I don't remember who else, but there were others that used magic stones as well.
Right, and just the minimizing it until finally one day, this is the one he used for the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And there's not an equivalent picture at the same time of a Urim and Thummim with the glasses. In terms of sources, a lot of people will come in and say, well, all that stuff we get from quote unquote hostile or anti-Mormon sources. So how do we historically go in and trust the occult origins of Mormonism?
Well, the Mormon Church published the photos of the stone.
Right, right. I mean, it's hard to get around that one.
That kind of validates the whole story.
Right. And I remember when they denied it. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember that feeling of being at church, having Quinn's book
Yeah.
and Brody's book, and you bring it up and it's denied.
Right.
To then just see it published online. I mean, it's surreal.
Right.
It's surreal.
But the Mormon Church has been on notice about this all along because David Whitmer, one of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon, wrote a pamphlet and addressed all believers in Christ in about 1887. And so his dying testimony is that Joseph's a fallen prophet. And he believed the Book of Mormon. He tells how Joseph translated the plates. And he said Joseph would sit there with a hat and put a stone in the hat, and God would make this divine light shine where he could read the text off of the stone to make the account of the Book of Mormon that he'd read off to the scribe. So the Mormon Church has always known that was how the early people described the process. The Mormon Church just quit talking about it. And so in time, everyone just forgot it. And so unless you had heard of David Whitmer's pamphlet, you wouldn't have necessarily read anything about Joseph using a stone in a hat. But David Whitmer's pamphlet wasn't that readily available. When we first started studying Mormonism, someone gave us a copy of David Whitmer's pamphlet. And so in our early research, we knew that scenario of the stone in the hat. We hadn't thought through all the implications of it, but
Right.
we were aware of David Whitmer's claim. And so the church leaders have no excuse today for hiding it all these years. They try to paint it today like, well, all this new research has come out, so now we know these things. No, they should have always known it. All my life, the LDS Church has pointed to David Whitmer as a witness to the Book of Mormon who never denied his testimony to the Book of Mormon. How do they know he never denied his testimony to the Book of Mormon? It's because he said that in this 1887 pamphlet.
Right.
And the 1887 pamphlet tells the translation process. So the church leaders have no excuse for not knowing the original story. And yet I grew up with being told all my life, Joseph Smith dug up, the angel showed him where the plates were, and they got them out of the ground. With the plates were these divinely preserved spectacles, which they describe as being bigger than regular spectacles. And because I guess it's supposed to be a big Nephite or something. Anyways, they got these big spectacles that he looked through to translate. Well, yeah, supposedly he found these spectacles with the plates that are divinely preserved for thousands of years. However, he finds his seer stone works easier. So a rock in his pocket he can carry around at any time. It's a lot easier in big spectacles. So the church has always known this scenario. They just were not telling us that part. They were just, it's like a wrinkle in time. We'll just pass over that magic part of our history and just keep going, and you don't have to know about that little dip. Only all through Mormon history, we have these little dips where, well, we don't talk about that part, you know. Put that in the bottom shelf, put that in the bottom shelf, you know. And so it looks like this steady line of their development. In actual fact, there's a lot of dips in the road on the way to the end.
This 1826 Bainbridge trial, just as an example, how do we know that happened?
Well, there were early statements by people about this trial, but no one had any documentation on it. It was just later reminiscences about it. And I think Brody mentions it briefly in the first edition of her book. And our friend, Minister Wesley Walters, Presbyterian minister in Illinois, had got involved in studying Mormon history. And he would spend his summers going up to New York trying to look for the early sources on Mormonism. he had read Von Brody. He knew of some of the neighbors' statements that had been printed in E.D. Howe's Mormonism Unveiled in 1834 or so, 1833. So in E.D. Howe's book, you have statements about the money digging stuff. Wes wanted to find out what records are still in New York in old dusty archives that no one's ever looked for that might support some of these later statements by people. And so he would spend all his spare time going up to New York to go through whatever archives he could find. He and a friend named Fred Pofferl, he and Fred went to the New York, Palmyra area looking for the early court documents that they had read people making reference to them, but no documentation. Well, then the records of the early court cases from Joseph Smith's time had been moved out of whatever original holding place they were in. As time went by, they became just archival material. And lo and behold, they'd ended up in the basement of the jail in Norwich, New York. And so it's a different town, even. And so you have this basement of this old, dusty jail with stacks of court records in bundles all around in the basement of this damp, old jail where they'd just been put and stored and forgot about. Well, Wes and Fred spent days going through bundles trying to find stuff that would be back to the Joseph Smith time frame.
Wow.
And voila, they opened this one package, and it's the 1826 period of court documents. And here is the judge's bill to the county for trying Joseph Smith, the glass looker.
It's just amazing.
The document was damp, and so when you see photos of the document now, the right-hand side of the document is stained dark, and that's because that's where it's wet. And it's a wonder the whole thing didn't disintegrate.
Right.
But so the documents were taken out of there. They were preserved. I had certified letters from the county clerk certifying that the photos that we have of the documents are authentic, but they're in my materials I just donated to the University of Utah. They aren't cataloged yet, so you can't go see them yet. But eventually it'll be archived. But it's a wonder that Wes was able to find them when he did because of the dampness in the basement and the condition of those documents. We're sure that the next year, if Wes had gone back a year later and found them, they probably would have just fallen apart in his hand because it was that damp in the basement. But it wasn't just the judges Albert Neely, 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 and his charges to the county were $2.68, I think, for presiding over this. Then we also have Constable DeZang bill to the county for arresting Joseph Smith and holding him as a prisoner for a couple of days, and a minimus to take him. I don't remember what all it says on the documents, but Wes found the actual documents of the bill to the county. Now, that's not the transcript of what happened in the hearing, but it proves the hearing happened. Mm-hmm. Now, a young woman by the name of Emily Pearsall, who became a Christian missionary and came out here to Utah in 1870s, something in that time frame. She was a niece, I believe, of Judge Neely, and she cut out of his docket book the papers that discuss the actual hearing itself. And she brought them with her to Utah. These documents ended up getting printed in a couple of different newspapers at the time. And the Mormons had always said, Pearsall's documents out here in Utah that she gave to these newspapers in the 1870s time frame are an invention. They aren't true. We don't know where to fit them in history. They're just junk, Well, when West found these papers for Judge Neely and Constable Desang, their charges to the county for their hearing with Joseph Smith, the Glasslooker, match the papers that this Miss Pearsall saved and brought west with her. She had told in there about the charges. And the date and the charges, everything matched.
Wow.
So we know that it's all authentic. Anyways, in the papers that she had brought out, it has all of this discussion of him owning up to, yes, I use a stone and a hat, but I have real power and all this stuff. So the Mormon Church today concedes all that, but they have to say, well, Joseph was just a teenager, his curiosity, it was a common thing of the day, a lot of people were into this, blah, blah, blah. Well, just because some people were into it doesn't mean that it was ordained of God or was respectable or was on honest business.
Right. And it was illegal for a reason.
Right. Because, yes, there were people conning people in the neighborhood.
Right. There's this, and even Quinn seems to do this a little bit, try to domesticate it so much to normalize it.
Right.
Which that's a helpful angle at points.
Yeah.
But then, this attempt to make it completely alien, also you could take that too far because there were people doing this and there was prominent beliefs. But I think, it kind of is beside the point. The point is, if this is God's prophet of the restoration and the claims have been his purity, and I mean purity,
yes.
that he's always been morally upstanding and, like a lamb led to the slaughter. How do you handle evidence like this? And the fact that these happen, I remember the statement, was it Hugh Nibley, that said, if true, dismissing this trial, this would be some of the most condemning evidence against the prophet, And then we have evidence now. I mean, and we did have evidence, but I mean, now it's just undeniable thanks to.
Yeah, so all the church can say is, it doesn't matter.
Right.
They used to say, no, that never happened.
That's exactly it.
So we proved it happened. Oh, well, that doesn't really matter.
Then now it's a preparatory priesthood.
Yeah, right.
So it just in sum, is there any way to truly separate the magic from LDS scripture?
Well, no, because you have him using the same rock that he uses for treasure digging to translate the Book of Mormon. It's the same claim. It's the same power, the same process. And so I don't see how you separate the two. And even the vision experiences, when you look at the witnesses, it's hard to not look at their statements and say, I think you guys were being sold a bill of goods, just like on Find and Buried Treasure, that you get this charismatic leader that gets these guys all primed that this divine spirit has guided him to these plates and he's been translating them. Now, you have to remember, the plates were not visible on the table. The Mormon picture portrayals in all their books in the past have shown the plates on the table. If the plates were really on the table, why would you have to take the three main witnesses, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery, why would you have to take the three of them out into the woods to pray for a divine manifestation to see the plates if they were on the table the whole time he's translating?
Right.
The very fact he has to take them into the woods to pray to see them tells you they didn't exist. Or all he has to do is lift the cover off of them. They're sitting there, they're sitting in the room somewhere. And because the witnesses say that they're covered or hidden somewhere, the church today has to show it as being the plates being opened on the table. But that's not what the witnesses said.
Right.
Their statements are that they aren't seeing the plates while he translates. Joseph's just talking to his scribe. He has to take him in the woods for a heavenly vision. And even then, the heavenly vision doesn't work at first, because he takes the three out to the woods. We're going to pray to get a vision where the angel's going to show us the plates, and nothing happens. And Martin Harris says, "Oh, I must be the doubting Thomas. I better step back from this because I guess I'm holding you guys up." He leaves, and supposedly then David and Oliver say, "Oh, yeah, they had a vision. They saw it and all." And so then Joseph goes to find Martin Harris. "Well, the other two have seen the vision. So what about you?" And then Joseph tells us that he and Martin prayed. So this is separate than the other two. He and Martin pray. And finally, Martin supposedly says, "Oh, 'tis enough mine eyes have beheld." Joseph is telling that story. Martin didn't tell that story. We don't have a first-hand account from Martin at that time. Now, later, here in Utah, he gives statements about seeing the plates, but it's always in a vision context. It's not physical.
Right.
So,
Spiritual eyes.
It's spiritual eyes. So I don't think that there was anything to show them. Joseph may have made up some sort of mock pieces of metal that he could keep in a bag that you could feel, and there was something of weight in there. It felt like metal. But they aren't seeing it physically.
Wow. The spring of 1820. So another founding claim is the revival context in the spring of 1820, where Joseph Smith, in vision, sees the Father and the Son. What's wrong with that dating? Let's start there. And how did we find out?
Okay, this goes back to our friend Pastor Walters.
Yeah, a hero of mine, as a fellow Presbyterian here.
Yes, so he's the hero. He is, well, we all were studying First Vision because, Fawn Brody had brought up that there was missing information about the First Vision account, that there were things about Joseph's early life that aren't clear, and she questioned this early aspect of his life. And so Gerald and we'd started our courtship all on First Vision problems. And
true love.
True love. And then we met Wes when we still believed the Book of Mormon, when we were half out of Mormonism. And so we were aware of Wes's research. And again, Wes's trips to New York. So he's out there trying to figure out, okay, you can't prove whether or not Joseph saw some sort of visionary person. However, you can test what he describes as the physical events around it. That can be tested. Joseph Smith says in 1820, due to the great turmoil of religious revival in his neighborhood that was so strong that people were fighting over, the ministers were fighting over who were going to get all the converts. And there was all this turmoil going on, some saying here, some saying there, And so Joseph goes out in the woods to pray which church he should join. So that's the way Joseph frames it. Okay, you can't prove whether or not he saw God, but you could prove whether or not there was a revival in the neighborhood to the extent that the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians specifically, those are the ones that are named, all were involved in a great revival where there would have been enough converts that people would have been fighting over what church they were going to. So Wes goes back to search the early church records in New York. And being a minister, he knew how to go about trying to find old church records. And he runs down these different churches' records because they aren't stored in the little church where they first happened. They all get turned into some synod or someplace, some storage house. So he's out looking for all of those. In his research, he realizes, wait a minute, there isn't a revival in 1820 like Joseph Smith's describing. The churches in 1820 only show modest membership growth, that would be a normal congregation's growth. Nothing that would indicate this momentous thing where all the ministers are fighting over the converts. That revival, that claim fits the 1823, 24, 25, through that period. There's a revival in the area that does fit that, where you have, a couple hundred people that join these different churches. This is obviously an astounding revival that's happening in the area. There's nothing like this in 1820. Now, the Mormons will point to, oh, yes, but there were revivals in 1817 or 18 or whatever. Not like this one, and they're too early.
Yeah.
Joseph Smith's just a kid. I mean, to move it back to an earlier time period makes it even less believable that Joseph would have been this troubled over what church to join. Because he's only 14 in 1820, and you're going to move it back to when he's 11? It just doesn't make sense. So, but what people describe of the revival, because there's statements by Joseph's family about this revival event, but it's later.
Yeah.
And so you have Joseph Smith's brother Alvin dies in 1823, and the revival happens after this. It's after Alvin's death that the family is concerned about religion. The revival happens. That's when Joseph's mother and sister and brother join the Presbyterian Church. And we know they joined because they later got dropped from the rolls. And so the whole thing fits historically to an 1824 time period, not 1820. And the problem is the Mormons can't just say, oh, well, just move all the dates up then. It happened in 24. It's after the time that the angel comes and tells them about the plates. That's supposed to happen in 1823. You can't have all of this happening after he's already been told about the plates. It screws up the whole time frame of the story. And because once he gets the plates, he has to wait 4 years before he can get them to translate them. So you can't just move everything up. You run out of years before the printing date. But we know that the revival is that later time period. 1820 doesn't fit. And even the apologists have to work to try to get either the revival to a broader section of the state and argue, well, it didn't just mean his neighborhood, it meant the whole, half of New York, to get enough people and commotion going on. But why would Joseph be troubled about what church to join? Why would these ministers clamoring for converts bother him to this point that he would go out and pray what church to join? That all points to something happening in his neighborhood, not 20 miles away.
Right. And even in some of those statements by the Smith family, we have even specific names, right, of ministers that also match the 1824-25 time frame and not the 1820 time frame, right? I think George Lane may have been one. Others that are also sources that match a revival, just not in 1820.
Yeah, wrong year.
Right. So, and you went into the stakes. And once again, just to emphasize, underscore for the listener, and this is going to be a theme throughout this, your husband, you, Wes Walters, this work is hard work.
Yes.
It's messy work.
It takes time and effort and using up your vacation time and all sorts of things.
Right. And I think, it's easy. I mean, we are benefiting from all these decades of work that y'all have put into this, and just we owe a debt of gratitude in finding these original documents, putting these pieces together, comparing sources over time. And so this to me, I wonder, it is interesting, this recent restoration proclamation by Nelson. You can tell he's trying to harmonize the accounts. And I want to go to the differing accounts here. By combining the 1838, I'm looking which church to join, with the earlier 1832, that's a little more salvation centered. But he is doubling down. They have doubled down on the spring of 1820, and I think you already hit why. It's because the first vision would actually be Moroni.
Right.
And that's what they don't want. Because that brings the magic stuff.
Yes, they have to have some kind of an encounter with God before the angel shows up to tell them about the Book of Mormon plates. And I think that's why he came up, part of the reason he came up with the idea of an earlier vision is I'm assuming that Christians around him were saying, you mean just bam, out of the blue, some angel shows up and tells you about a hidden record of God. When did you become a Christian? When did you give your life to Christ? Surely you had some encounter with God before this angel shows up about these plates. Yeah, I should have had a better start to the story. Okay, yeah, I remember now. I'm glad you asked that because, yes, in 1820, actually, I had seen the Father and Son, and so that's how it got started. So it fits when you look at how people tell of when they talked to the Smiths and what Smith told them at different time periods. It's obvious that he started telling people at first about the plates and about this Indian record and about this angel. Then he comes up with an earlier story that, before that happened, I had this vision, and I don't think he was telling people at that early time period that it was the Father and Son. We know that he wrote an account in 1832. Mormonism starts in 1830. That's when he prints the Book of Mormon. 1832, in his private papers, he writes an account of his early life where he says that he went out in the woods to pray to know if his sins were forgiven. If a divine being did exist, was he accepted of him? Is he forgiven of his sins? And the Lord appears to him and says his sins are forgiven. There's nothing in this about this restoration movement. This is just a standard conversion story that many people would have been talking about at the time. You have many ministers and early Christians in the same time period of Joseph Smith saying that they had some sort of vision of Christ or God or both at the time they pray for forgiveness of sins. So this story he comes up with in 1832 in his private papers is no different than many other similar accounts of people claiming experiences outside of Mormonism in the Christian community. They went out in the woods to pray for forgiveness of sins, and God appeared and told them their sins were forgiven. So it just sounded like everybody else's. So now he has a conversion story to tell you. Oh, well, yeah, the angel came, but before that, I had a conversion experience like you're asking me about. But then as the years go by, he thinks he needs a more grandiose story for the start of it. So in 38, he starts writing his history again, this time for publication. And now he's going to have the story, that he already knew all the churches were wrong. Well, no, the first account in 32 says he already knew all the churches were wrong when he goes out to pray. And he's not asking what church to join. He just wants to know if his sins are forgiven. In 38, he writes, he didn't know what the situation was of the churches. And it's at that time that God told him, they're all wrong, don't join any of them. So the message has changed. From the first time he writes the story down, it's now changed. So now God's telling him, all the churches are wrong, don't join any of them. And the Father and Son appear in this, although he doesn't say Father and Son. He just says that the two beings in brightness and glory appeared, and one pointed to the other and said, that this is my son, hear him, or whatever. And the Mormons will use that to prove that Joseph Smith was saying he saw God and Jesus as two separate people standing next to each other. But we know from historical research that Joseph Smith was not, in 1838, he was not telling the public that the Father and Son are physical beings like they know today. In one of his scripture books in 1835, they had lectures in there for the brethren, and one of the lectures, lecture 5, I can't remember, says that the Father is a being of spirit and the Son's a being of tabernacle. And so it shows in 1835 what they're teaching the elders is that the Father doesn't have a physical form. But by 38, he's starting to think in terms of, oh, yeah, I think those guys must be separate beings. So the Father and Son both appeared to me. But it still isn't until in the 1840s that Joseph Smith starts getting really clear on trying to separate the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit from each other as separate deities. Mormonism has a developing view of God. It goes from one God in the Book of Mormon to multiple gods by the time you get to Nauvoo in the 1840s.
Yep.
And so people ask me about, how can you get around the first vision? And I said, well, which first vision are we talking about? And he saw the Father and the Son. Well, which version of that? Is that the Father who's a spirit or the Father who's a physical being? Because the story changes.
Yeah, you and Gerald were, if I'm not mistaken, if not the first, some of the first to point out these different accounts, correct?
Right.
And you were bringing this to the attention of even, say, Elder LeGrand Richards, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes,
Is that who you mentioned?
we had, yes, in the 1959-60 time period when we just had got married and were researching, trying to figure out whether we believed Mormonism anymore.
Yeah.
We had been studying on First Vision, and when I decided to leave Mormonism in 1960, I sent a letter out to all the general authorities and everyone in my ward saying that I was leaving. And one of the things I mentioned in my letter was that there were problems with the first vision, that our research had shown that the early accounts of the first vision seemed to just be talking about angels. And it wasn't emphasized. No one seems to be emphasizing this father-son narrative, which LeGrand Richards, apostle, wrote and challenged us that his great-grandfather had written in his daily journal that Joseph Smith had personally told him that he saw the Father and the Son in this vision. And so we questioned LeGrand Richards on whether that could be so. We wanted to see the journal that had that statement in it because it didn't fit what we had found in our research so far. So we go up to the Grand Richards office. He takes us over to the genealogical library to see the microfilm. And when he puts the microfilm on, he turns to this certain page of his great-grandfather's diary that's on film and gets to the page and shows Gerald, here it is. And Gerald says, well, it sounds past tense as though Joseph Smith's dead, not like a daily diary that you came home that night and wrote an entry in. It sounds past tense. And Gerald wanted to be able to turn the film back to see the earlier dates to verify when he wrote this down. And LeGrand wouldn't let him look back at the earlier pages. And he and Gerald had kind of an argument over this whole thing. Well, later, I went back to the church historians, the genealogical library, to see the film. And at first they told me it was out for repairs several times until finally months went by and I went up again and finally, because I already had the call number for the film and just turned it in without having to look it up in the card catalog or anything. I just turned in the number. The lady said, well, how did you have that number? And I said, well, I copied it down when I was here months ago and did research, but I need to check the dates. So she thought I was approved, and she got out the film for me. And then I find out, no, it's the guy's memoirs here in Utah in the 1880s. So it does nothing to prove that during Joseph Smith's lifetime that he was making it clear to people it was a father and son. And this supposedly was an entry, this is really getting in the weeds, in
We love it.
1841, I believe, is when he's supposed to make this entry that Joseph told him father, son. So this is before the time of his King Follett sermon where Joseph Smith goes more detailed into the father and son being separate beings and God progressing to godhood and stuff. So in 1841, that's why we knew there was something wrong with it. Because in 1841, we just couldn't imagine that anyone is writing down, Joseph Smith told him he'd seen the father and son. It didn't fit with anything we'd found in our research. People that made reference to the first vision usually we're saying it was angels or something, or some kind of vision, but not making this kind of physical distinction on God.
Right.
And we turned out we were right. It was the guy's
Didn't fit.
memoirs.
Exactly. No, I remember one of the first times it struck me was a sermon, I believe, by John Taylor, in which he's emphasizing the angel.
Yeah.
He doesn't even name him.
Yeah.
But it's like, when this work was begun with the coming of the angel, you know?
Yeah.
And you're like, what? What? No, doesn't even sound like 1838.
Yeah.
So when we were preparing for this, you had mentioned that one of the last things to, I guess, dominoes to fall for you was the Book of Mormon itself. Right. And I definitely want to get into some of the issues. I want to point out, and this will, of course, be in the show notes, if this was the only book you and your husband did, I mean, that would be incredible. And yet, of course, we
And
put
you didn't
many
tell
more.
people what book it was.
It is Joseph Smith's plagiarism of the Bible and the Book of Mormon. And you even include some confessional language that comes from, later confessions.
From the Westminster Confession.
Exactly. Yeah. Somehow ancient Native Americans were debating clauses from the Westminster Confession of Faith. But this is an incredible work. But do you want to say anything to the audience in terms of why the Book of Mormon was so hard to give up for you?
Well, as two young people trying to figure out if Mormonism's true, when we've had people bring problems to us, either it's true at the start or it's not true. You can't have the base be false and Joseph Smith later be the true prophet of the true church. So we felt, all right, what's the first thing of Mormonism? That's the Book of Mormon. Okay, then that's our litmus test. If the Book of Mormon's true, everything in the rest of Mormonism has to agree with the Book of Mormon. And so at first, from that reasoning, that took out Brigham Young and Joseph Smith's King Follett sermon and all sorts of stuff when you just make the Book of Mormon your base. Now, it didn't occur to us as young Mormons that we could have used the Bible as the litmus test, but as young Mormons, we had been trained that the Bible wasn't that reliable. The Book of Mormon was more reliable than the Bible. Okay, we're going to use the Book of Mormon as our litmus test. If it doesn't agree with that, we're throwing it out. Well, of course, that raises the whole question, well, how sure are you about the Book of Mormon?
Right, right.
And once we had people start challenging us that, like, okay, you're doubting Mormonism, why not the Book of Mormon? Why do you still believe it? Oh, well, because it's this great story of the American Indian and how God didn't forget a whole continent. Well, how do you know it really happened? And so Gerald, after we got married, we were using the Bible and Book of Mormon for devotions because we'd come to faith in Christ. We just hadn't got rid of the Book of Mormon yet. So we're using that as a devotional. And Gerald started, and the King James Bible.
Right.
We were, you come out of Mormonism, you just got a King James Bible.
Yep.
So we're reading our King James Bibles with our Book of Mormon, and the more he reads the two, and Gerald had very good memory, and as he's reading these two different times, he starts to put it together in his mind. Wait a minute. There's stuff in the Book of Mormon that sounds just like in the Bible. There's phrases all through here that are King James phrases. It isn't just that it's the same thought. It's King James wording. Now, if God's going to give the translation of the record on the plates, word for word to Joseph Smith, like David Whitmer said, and we went by David Whitmer. Whitmer said it was word for word. Okay. Would God give the Nephite record to Joseph Smith with King James English? Why wouldn't it just be in regular English? Why King James? And so the Book of Mormon is all in these and thous of Elizabethan English, which Joseph gets wrong. And he doesn't speak it because he doesn't use the tenses right and things. So I think God would have known if he was going to do King James, I think God would have been better at it.
Right, right. And if he's reading the words off the stone.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So Anyway, so it all comes out in King James English. And the more Gerald saw this, the more it raised questions. Then he read different Mormon scholars trying to answer Book of Mormon questions. At that time, there was a book, a series of books, A New Witness for Christ in America by Francis Kirkham. And Kirkham was a Mormon scholar. And so he was the go-to guy of the 1950s of a scholarly person looking at criticism of the Book of Mormon as a historical record. And so Gerald's going through Kirkham trying to reconcile all of these things, and he's realizing more and more, wow, there's stuff in here that doesn't add up. But the King James was a major factor that made us more open to read critical things on Book of Mormon. And then you start to realize, wait a minute, there's no map in a Book of Mormon. My Bible has maps. Why doesn't my Book of Mormon have maps? And it hadn't really occurred to me that, okay, where did the story happen? Well, then you start finding out there's different views of where the Book of Mormon even happened amongst Mormon scholars. So, and that was true back in the 50s, and it's true in Mormonism today. The maps are a little different of how they want to draw that out, but it's the same question of trying to figure out where the story could have happened. It doesn't fit anywhere. Well, then you start finding out the plant life is wrong. They can't be growing wheat. And we know that because they can dig up pottery from the dump yard of a Indian village or whatever, and they can tell what they had for dinner. Somebody burnt the tortillas and threw the whole pot out, and they can see that. They weren't having wheat pancakes. They're having tortillas with corn. And so the Book of Mormon says they're raising wheat. There's no evidence for the American Indians having wheat at this time frame. The animals in the Book of Mormon are wrong. They're all animals from the old world that Joseph Smith assumed that the Book of Mormon people brought with them. The cows and horses and sheep and all these things. Chickens, yes, yes. That's a problem. And so you got all these things in the Book of Mormon that don't fit historically. And when you get into the field of anachronisms, then how do you explain all that? So the Mormon scholars have to say, well, yes, it says horse, but they didn't really mean horse. Horse would have just been Joseph's word that he used because he didn't know what the American Indian word in the Book of Mormon text was, some kind of beast of burden animal that they had, and so he just said horse. But God's given him the translation.
Right.
And the fact that the Book of Mormon does mention curlums and cumums. So in the Book of Mormon today, you have supposedly the words that the Indians would have used for two sets of animals that today we don't know what they are. If you would have that kind of use at that point, then why do we get the word horse? Why instead of horse, why isn't there just another word there that we wouldn't know what it meant or what it went to or would have to guess? So it's an inconsistency in the story because I think Joseph had in his mind probably buffalo and elk or something, and the curlums and cumums. But horses, he just could say horse, because I think Joseph thought it was horse. But he has them as elephants and all sorts of stuff. So those are things that came into the picture that make us wonder. And then I read M.T. Lamb, a minister here in Salt Lake. M.T. Lamb wrote a book, The Golden Bible. Now, Mr. Lamb had given a series of lectures here in Utah in the late 1880s. The lectures were put into a book form, and it was the first serious evaluation of the text of the Book of Mormon. And I read that, and that was the final blow for me, because he goes through and talks about Mayan script not matching anything of the Anthon transcript that Joseph Smith produced for the Book of Mormon sample of writing. Lamb goes into the all these problems of anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, changes. He talks about the life of the people does not sound like Jewish community. They aren't doing the Jewish holidays, and yet the Book of Mormon says they're living the law of Moses. But it doesn't sound like Jewish people following the Jewish calendar. It sounds like Protestants. It fits a lot better in that scenario. So as I'm reading through Lamb, just one after another, thing after thing comes up. But the one that really stuck on my mind at the time was in it, Lamb talks about the sacrificial system used by the Jews because of the law of Moses, which supposedly they were keeping. And in it, he gives the example of the Book of Mormon has them making their personal offerings of the first of their flock. But in the law of Moses, the first of your flock automatically belonged to God. Your personal offerings would have had to have been outside of that first offering that was already God's. And so Lamb brings this point out, and I thought, well, yeah, if they were really Jews at 600 BC, I mean, they just got off the boat over here, and they're keeping the law of Moses. It's not like, well, it's been so many hundreds of years they forgot. If they're right off the boat and they're claiming to keep the law of Moses, then they would know all the ritual sacrifice laws, and they wouldn't be doing the sacrifices wrong. And I talked to a BYU guy about this one time, and he says, oh, well, that's all just nitty-gritty stuff. Who would even know about that stuff? And I said, Protestants wouldn't know about that, but a Jew at 600 BC would have known. That's
right.
So how could Lehi get this wrong?
Yep, absolutely. And it's funny that Restoration Proclamation I mentioned just a little bit ago, it's now so vague that it's the Western Hemisphere. Yeah. So it happens somewhere in the Western Hemisphere. And then it used to be all, right, the inhabitants of the Americas. And now it's among, and it just keeps shrinking, to quote my pastors, the amazing vanishing Lamanites, right?
Right.
And so, but at the end of the day, anything that fits is so broad, it could fit anybody.
Right.
Solar symbolism on their buildings.
Right.
That could be said of any people. That could be said of people anywhere in the world.
Right.
So there's nothing, is there anything in the Book of Mormon where you're like, I nailed this in a way that's distinctive enough to make you pause? No,
because anything that is accurate in it is stuff that was known in Joseph's day.
Yeah. Yeah, and then he's extrapolating.
Yeah.
And I've even read there's a distinction between the Native Americans as in the 1800s versus the time of the Book of Mormon. And so it's not even accurate to extrapolate from Native Americans in the 1800s to 1800 years earlier.
Right, right. Just like chickens.
Yes, exactly.
Chickens of his day would have been known to the Indians. They weren't known to the Book of Mormon people.
Right. Fanny Alger. That's turning this corner. This is a huge one. And I remember this was a big one for me. So the narrative, I think it has to be. I can't see a way for the LDS apologist around it. Like Fanny Alger, for them, has to be Joseph Smith's first plural wife, right?
Right. When you ask a Mormon about when did Joseph Smith first get the revelation on plural marriage, it used to be the quick answer was, well, you can read all about that in section 132.
Right.
But the church leadership came to realize that, well, we got to find some way to justify this earlier than that because he's got plural wives before section 132 was even given. Okay, so when did he first get it? Well, it must have been when he was working on the translation of the Old Testament when he did his revision of the Bible in the 1830-31 time period. So they'll say, oh, well, that was in 1831 is when he got revelation on that. Well, there's nothing written down to say he got any kind of revelation about it at that time period. But they also have to get it back early enough to cover the incident with Fanny Alger. Mormons have always been stuck with this problem. Fanny doesn't fit the timeline of when Joseph should have been told by God to live plural marriage. And even if you use the Book of Mormon, she doesn't fit that scenario, because it was to raise up seed was the only condition the Book of Mormon gives for polygamy. It was if God was going to raise up seed. Well, he didn't have seed with Fanny, so, or at least not that we know of.
Right.
That's another question. But, okay, so when the Mormons are in Kirtland, Ohio, in the mid-1830s, there's this young girl that's living in the Smith home, Fanny Alger, or Alger, however you pronounce her name. And so Fanny starts living in the Smith home, I think, when she's 15, and has to move out when she's 17. So she's living in the home as a house helper. Oliver Cowdery, one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, who's very active in the church at this time, accuses Joseph Smith of having an adulterous affair with Fanny Alger. And so this comes before the church council and in private. And Joseph has Oliver put out of the church over this, because he had accused the prophet of adultery, and he's lying. So he's lying about Joseph. So the church is stuck on the horns of a dilemma. History shows there was a charge of adultery given by Oliver Cowdery. So what do you do with that? Cowdery wrote to his brother Warren in 1837, we're getting in the weeds, and says, I stood Joseph to his face about his dirty, nasty, filthy affair, or scrape, with Fanny Alger, which is him telling about when they had this confrontation with the elders over whether Joseph was guilty of adultery. So what do you do with Fanny? So the church has to make the knowledge of polygamy revelation predate some way Fanny Alger. And so they say, oh, well, it must have been in 31 when he's working on the Old Testament. This is all behind Emma's back. Now, Emma didn't know anything about this, and she evidently caught Joseph in the barn with Fanny. Now, the Mormons want to say, oh, well, we don't know that there was any sexual connotation to this whole thing. Cowdery saw it as an adulterous affair, and there is evidence that, secondhand evidence, that Emma caught Joseph in the barn with Fanny. We do know that right after this kerfuffle of all this stuff, that Fanny left the Smith home and went and lived with another Mormon family for just a few months before she went to her parents' home. And I don't remember the locations of where everyone was living to know why it was that progression, but she didn't go immediately to her parents. And then she and her parents moved, and within the year, I think, she marries some military guy, as I recall, and is out of the Mormon picture. And she never would talk about her connection to Joseph Smith after this. And, well, a white girl wants to admit, oh, yeah, when I was 15, I was in the barn with Joseph when his wife caught us. So the question is whether Fanny was pregnant. And, you know, it's one of those things in history that you can't prove one way or the other. But the Fanny Alger connection leaves the Mormons on the horns of a dilemma of, can we make this a religious situation and not Joseph being unfaithful to Emma behind her back? And so they have to list her as the first plural wife. And they have a very late recollection of somebody like 75 years later or something, that the guy saying, my dad told me he performed a ceremony for this thing. Well, that's a little late. I mean, if I were giving a late memory on Joseph being adulterer, they sure wouldn't accept it at that late date. But they'll take this statement. But other than that, they can't deny the connection to Fanny.
Right.
But but Emma's not involved in this. And then when you move into Nauvoo period in the 1840s, when Joseph's more clearly having live-in affairs with different women, it's still before the revelation's given. He's got over 20 wives, women. And I don't like to use the word wife because these are not marriages. These are a few words spoken between us. Hey, you could be my eternal companion, and we'll do this little ceremony, and I'll say something and pray, and then we're married. These aren't real marriages. They're just arrangements to them that they're saying are religious. So you have 1841, Louisa Beeman, a single woman in Nauvoo. They have some ceremony down by the river, and she's disguised in men's clothing, so no one will know what's even going on when they have this supposed ceremony. But Emma knows nothing about this. And then he goes on to have a marriage arrangement, whatever you want to call it, with, I don't remember the count, like 8 or more women after Louisa that are married women. They have living husbands. And Emma doesn't know about this. Some of the husbands knew, some didn't. If anyone else did this in any other church, the Mormons would say, oh, that horrible pastor, can you believe anyone would believe that guy after he was exposed for doing this? Right. Well, here comes this John Bennett, who was a convert into Mormonism. He writes up an expose because he leaves Mormonism, and he says, hey, Joseph's got this secret doctrine. And not only that, he's got at least seven women that we know of that he's claiming these relationships with. And Bennett lists these women by initials, not spells out their whole name. And so like Louisa Beeman, you would have L and then the number of asterisks to spell out her name, and then B and then the number of asterisks to spell out the end of her name. And so we have 7 women listed in this book that we can now plug back in the first initials to know who the women are. And they are 7 women that the church has to admit are his plural wives. So if Emma didn't know about it, she's just putting her head in the sand, because it was published 1842, whenever it was, where Bennett's making this accusation. But Joseph's telling everyone, oh, it's all lies. No, I'm saving innocent man. I can only find one wife. Yeah. Right. and yet he hasn't even given section 132 yet when all this is going on. Well, it all becomes such a big mess that Hiram, Joseph's brother, finally says, Joseph, you've had all these problems with Emma, but I think if you write that down, give me the revelation written down, I'll take it to Emma, and I think I can convince her this is really true. So Joseph writes out section 132, it's a pretty long revelation, and Hiram goes off to show it to Emma. Emma evidently has a real argument with Hiram about this. Hiram comes back and tells Joseph, and this is in church literature, Hiram comes back and tells Joseph, I never received such a severe talking to in my life. Emma did not take to this. Joseph does finally get her to consent to 2 sets of sisters at that time, the Partridge sisters and the Lawrence sisters. But he's already had more than 20 women that he's told they've got these plural marriages with before Emma's ever even informed of this. So it's such a messy history, and how anyone can look to this man and say, this is God's prophet, seer, and revelator. And they'll point to, well, prophets, all kind of prophets have sinned. Look at David. Yeah, look at David. Yes, he took a wife, And God didn't think that was kosher. So why would I accept a man that is taking all these women behind his back? He's doing something illegal. It's not just a preference. It's illegal. Illinois had a law against bigamy. And he's got a couple dozen women that he's claiming as some sort of spiritual wives. We know he had sex with them. We can't prove that he had sex with all of them. The Mormons are always saying, well, you can't prove he had sex with them. The Mormon scholars will concede at least 11 or 12 women that Joseph had relations with, either from the women's statements or their relative statements or their friends' statements, that we can put together incidences where we know that he had physical relations with a third, anyways, of his wives.
And that's key, because I remember, even if someone would concede the polygamy of Joseph Smith, it was always followed up quickly with, but it wasn't sexual.
Yeah.
But you're saying the evidence shows that we can prove even sexual relations with some of them.
Right. And if you've got 10 or 12, why not all?
Yeah.
Why?
Where should the bias be where the evidence is more ambiguous?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like there's, to tie some of these things together, with the magic in the early period, they want to over-contextualize it to put blame on, as if it's society's problem, not Joseph's. He couldn't control where he grew up or whatever. Here, they need to make it more otherworldly, because if it's so obvious in the Bible, why weren't Christians doing it? Yeah. Why was it illegal? Why was he hiding it? Why was he trying to hide the fact that he was doing this, right? And so they have to make it otherworldly. Well, God's laws are not our ways, or make it as if society was in the way. And so notice really the common denominator is a Procrustean bed of making the evidence fit Joseph's purity. That's really what dominates, right? I mean, so if this stuff looks sinful, they don't want to go so far as to sanctify the sin, but they kind of have to, right? To say, well, Joseph still is this moral example. In fact, you still see that in the manuals, that he's the model for the LDS life.
Right.
As they craft what his life was.
Well, and in today's world, where the Mormons are posting different historical statements on their website about polygamy, they want to paint it all as God brought this to Joseph Smith. It wasn't something he brought up because of his lust. God commanded him to take plural wives, and we don't understand it all, and someday we'll know. But this was all holy, and this was a beautiful thing. And they'll even admit on their in their Gospel Topics essays stuff that they admit he had 30 to 40 plural wives, and they want to make these all as though this was God ordained, God blessed, holy unions. Then why don't they publish officially a list of the wives?
Yeah.
It seems like they're hiding who these women were. Why would you hide them if, in fact, they made this great sacrifice to live this new law of God, that in spite of public opposition, they obeyed God? I mean, if Section 132 really came from God, why don't they honor these women?
Right.
That sacrificed everything, reputation, to do what they felt was honoring to God. If that's really the scenario, then they should be proud to list all these women. Tell us the dates when he married them. Their age. Were they married?
Right.
Some of these details, and they won't give us any of that, which says to me they're really embarrassed by it. When you just hear the number in a footnote, he had 30 to 40, it's not the same as having the list where you could see their ages, whether or not they're married, that it's like every month he's getting another wife there in Nauvoo. It just looks so sketchy.
Yeah.
That it's, okay, if God commanded him to live polygamy, would God really make him marry this many women? Why married women? Why teenage girls? the teenage girls would have found husbands. There were girls that were being courted that the girls had to turn away the guy. And so it's not like they couldn't have found someone to be married to. The married women already had husbands. He doesn't need to be marrying them. So the whole thing falls apart. So they have to do what they can. On the one hand, you have today, in today's world, the polygamy deniers. There's a whole group of people out there, Mormons, that are saying, oh, Joseph never lived polygamy. That's all lies of the enemies of the church. So the church has to come out and say, the polygamy deniers are wrong. Joseph really lived polygamy, but it was holy. And so you guys over there that want to attack us because he was living polygamy, it was from God. And he really lived it because the polygamy deniers are making a big fuss in the Mormon community that he never touched it. So they're between a rock and a hard place.
Absolutely. We had the honor of having recently John Turner on to discuss his recent biography. And he mentions at the beginning of the book that, one of the big questions in all of this is who was Joseph Smith truly, and how would you explain him? And if you were, let me just pose that question to you. Who was Joseph Smith, and how would you explain who he is?
He is a great storyteller, also a bit narcissistic. He's God's prophet. He has the power to find buried treasure. He has the power to talk to angels. He has the power to talk to God. He has the power to marry as many women as he wants. He has the power to start a whole city. He has the power to raise a militia of 2,000 or 3,000 people, men there in Nauvoo. The Nauvoo Legion was the size of like a third of the U.S. Army. Kind of scary. He has himself appointed Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion. He has this great ego that he has to always be the head man, the guy on top of everything, big ideas, great storyteller. He can get people to believe him. His gift is the gift of storytelling. That he must have some sort of charisma about him, that he was a great salesman, a car salesman. He could have done great as a car salesman. And his ability to try to rise above his poor beginning is shown in what he is trying to build this whole community by the end of his life. When he marries Emma, in his own story at the back of the Pearl of Great Price, he tells when he marries Emma that they were so poor that they had no hope of ever being otherwise. And I think that's telling. There's a phrase in the Book of Mormon I think is telling that says, whatsoever persuadeth to do good is from God. Now, on the surface, that can sound good, but think of what you could rationalize with that. All you have to do is convince yourself this is ultimately for good, and I can do whatever I want then. So I can make up a book of scripture for it. It's for good. It's to help people come to Christ. So it doesn't matter if there were Indians or there ever was this story. It's persuading people to do good. And how many times have Mormons told us, oh, but the Book of Mormon has such beautiful teachings about Jesus.
Yeah.
Yes, that's not enough to make it scripture.
Right.
And I mean, Ellen G. White in the Seventh-day Adventist wrote some very inspiring things for her movement. That doesn't make them scripture or from a prophet either. So Joseph has this one desire to get out of poverty, and the other to build his idea of the ideal community. But of course, with him at the top, he's going to run for president of the United States. I mean, this is the ultimate ego. He's going to be the head of absolutely everything wherever he goes. So I see him as a great storyteller who's a narcissist.
Right. Does it surprise you that it persists? That we're still talking about him not as just an interesting historical phenomenon, but as the founder of a religion that, at least in parts of the world, is still growing, maybe not here, does it surprise you? You know, what do you think about
Oh,
that?
yeah, it's kind of amazing. Well, I think if Joseph would have lived, he would have ruined his movement. I think he would have been exposed as a fraud. But by being killed in the jail, it gave the Mormons a martyr. They were very fortunate that Brigham Young stepped in to be the leader, because had Sidney Rigdon become the leader or James Strang, the church would have gone into ruin. And we know that because the movements they headed up did go into ruin. So the Mormons were lucky, cursed, blessed, whatever way you want to paint it, that Brigham was the most level-headed of the men that stepped forward to lead it. Sidney Rigdon had some brain concussions in years before and may have affected his mind a little bit. I don't know what happened to Strang for his search for glory as a prophet, but Brigham seemed to be the most level-headed in the crowd. And so by him leading the church, he was able to hold it together, to arrange the Mormons in their trek west. He was a good enough organizer when they got out here to build a kingdom. It wouldn't still be here today if it wasn't for Brigham Young. But once you get past the polygamy period, then you get the Mormon church shifting from a end times prophetic movement, waiting for Christ's return any day, into entering the mainstream of society in 1900. And then they are moving away from polygamy. That's behind them. They've got to reorganize themselves, and then they've got to fit in with American society. So that helped them to stay as a religious movement. If they'd have stayed with the old return of Christ, polygamy kind of thing, they would have fallen apart. But because of that, they were able to make the shift into American society and decide they were going to cooperate with the government now instead of fighting against it. Mm-hmm. Then they enter into the corporate model, and they are growing, and once they get past, they have a financial crisis right after the turn of the century, but once they get past the financial crisis at the very start there, they start to make investments. Of course, they're here in Salt Lake, and they own all the land, so they can start building a kingdom. They invest in land, they invest in farmland, and as their portfolio grows, they get better and better financial guys into top church leadership that then move the church into a corporate model. And Mormonism is run today like a corporation. In fact, the president of the church is the president of the corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's not a model any other church follows that I know of.
Yeah.
So it becomes then a business model, and they're struggling here in America to make converts. They're making it in other lands, but that also brings the problem of how do you have a church headquartered in Salt Lake City with a church growing in Africa and Asia and South America and not in the United States.
Right.
So in time, it's going to be a problem on leadership. Do you start bringing in more and more foreign-born apostles? In the past, the apostles have been related some way or another. There's huge interrelatedness amongst many of the Mormon top leadership. There are a few now coming into apostleship that are convert. You have, a few Africans in the 70s, but not in the Quorum of 12. You do have a couple of different ethnic people represented in the 12 now. Can the church make the shift into international leadership? And I think that might be their next test on growth. can they change from pioneer heritage Mormonism to international-led church? And if they do, does that have the same sticking power of keeping people a part of the system? Before, we all were related. I mean, I got thousands of cousins, so,
Yeah.
so and that was part of the glue that held the Mormonism together, was this interrelatedness of everybody. You don't want to disappoint your family. If people are from too diverse of backgrounds, can you have the same commitment of loyalty to a very demanding religion?
Right.
And that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and it seems like it also runs the risk of taking away what may be, in certain parts of the world, the allure of Mormonism as, America, rich,
Yeah.
right? And that might be part of the allure, as it is for other prosperity preachers that we also
Yes.
don't like,
Yeah.
Benny Hinn and others, that, part of, I think, the allure in these countries, like, I want to be rich like America, but if you transition again, that might take away some of that. But I want to, we'll put in the show notes several examples. I cannot emphasize enough. Of course, longtime listeners, longtime people in this space will obviously know the contributions of you and your husband to Mormon studies. I mean, there are some things I just, it seems like, a book came out last year. You guys were talking about it 50 years ago.
Yes.
Book of Abraham, all that stuff. There's not a topic that doesn't have the fingerprints of the work of Gerald and yourself. And so I just want to thank you for all your work, all your years of service to understanding Mormonism and helping Christians understand Mormonism.
Right.
And so I just want to make that point before I ask you the concluding question.
Okay.
You are a descendant of Brigham Young, correct?
Yes, he's my great-great-grandpa. And through his son, Brigham Young Jr., who was an apostle. And then my grandpa was Walter, son of Brigham Jr. So my mother's maiden name was Young. And I grew up with great pioneer stories of how God saves polygamists from the law. And
Wow. Yeah. Well, I've been doing a deep dive into John Taylor. And so, yeah, that's, you grew up with those stories.
yeah, isn't that wonderful? Oh, yes, my great-grandma Young, last living plural wife of Brigham Young Jr., had one of her favorite stories to tell was how she married Brigham Jr. in 1887. It was already against the law to live polygamy, and the whole leadership of the church was in hiding for fear of being arrested. So one of the times when he was at her place, they got word through the underground that the federal marshals were coming to look for him. And so Abby tells Brigham Jr., change into my bed clothes and my bed cap and get into bed and just kind of hide your face in that and just kind of moan or whatever, like you're real sick, shivering or whatever over in the bed. And so the marshal comes to the door, we're here to get Brigham Jr., we hear he's here. And she says, well, you could come in and search the whole house. All I ask is that you don't disturb my poor mother who is sick in bed and on the point of dying. But you're welcome to search the house. So they search the whole house and they don't find Grandpa Young. And they go off, and then Brigham and her have this big laugh about how they fooled the federal marshals. Well, yes. Those are kind of great faith-promoting stories.
Yeah, it's a dying breed of story that the people tell themselves. The reason I bring that up is, you and I both know that a lot of people that will discover the truth about Joseph Smith don't leave at all. They just stay socially. Leave into agnosticism, atheism, sometimes even a lifestyle that reminds me of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. But why? And then I've heard this. It's a double standard. If you used the same amount of scrutiny toward the Bible or Christianity, it would disprove that. What would you say in conclusion? What would you say to someone who says, aren't you using a double standard? And why is Christianity survived the same test in your mind?
Well, you have a different set of issues. We can't answer every question about historicity in the Bible. There are cities we can't find. There's not ancient records that go back to the time of Moses. But we do have ancient manuscripts. We can show the preservation of the text when you get into recorded history time. There is documented evidence of the manuscripts for the Old and the New. Dead Sea Scrolls did a lot to show that the Old Testament records go back into the 600 time frame BC. And in the New Testament, you have all kind of archaeological manuscripts that parts of the Book of John that go to 130 and 180 AD that support the transmission of the Book of John. So I think that there are different questions. The Book of Mormon has nothing to support the civilization. It isn't that we have less, it's we have zero. Yeah. And so we have tons of evidence for historical claims for the Bible. We have zero evidence for the Book of Mormon's story. So I am not saying there aren't issues to resolve in the Bible.
Absolutely.
It's that it is still a historical record. Mm-hmm. You can find different accounts of any item in any history. You can find differing accounts or lack of records or whatever, but there's always some kind of evidence for something in historical events. But you have nothing for the Book of Mormon. The Mormons do not have a a Book of Mormon museum. They don't have a place to see the artifacts. There aren't any.
Right.
So it's a whole different type of issue.
Absolutely. And this is, one thing too, I remember being in that vulnerable space of not knowing what is next. But I couldn't leave Jesus.
No.
Like I couldn't just, and I had done enough to know, okay, that, I know there's mythicists out there, but Jesus of Nazareth existed. These are reliable accounts of his life. They fit into a context. These places exist. Nazareth exists.
And we have maps.
And right.
We can trace the journeys of Paul.
Right. And the more we dig, the more we find, rather than the opposite.
Right.
But I just really appreciate that. And I think along with that gratitude for your work in Mormon studies, thank you so much for your example in terms of not giving up on God, not giving up on Jesus. I think it'll mean a lot to some of the listeners.
Yes, amen.
Sandra, hey, thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful.
Okay.
What an honor.
Great.
Thank you.